Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, and you can tell from the fact that I'm wearing a tie that we're going to be talking about Beethoven's Ninth, because you have to wear a tie when you talk about Beethoven's Ninth. After all, it's the acme of orchestral music, the jewel of symphonic culture, and no discussion of Beethoven's Ninth is complete without appropriate attire. So here you go, you get a tie. And now we really need to discuss a topic that has bothered me for most of my critical career, and maybe you too, some of you may have noticed, which is why Furtwängler's Nazi Ninth, the one recorded in March 1942 with Hitler and Goebbels in the audience, really sucks, and why so many people refuse to admit the fact. It really is demented. It's like some sort of mass hallucination or hysteria. It really is. And because it's a public domain recording and it's on YouTube in about, a dozen different versions, I can actually play some excerpts and we can hear just how miserable it really is. But first, I think we need to talk about the circumstances and what Furtwängler was doing, because part of its mystique has to do, obviously, with the actual occasion on which it was performed. Furtwängler was not a Nazi. Let's not kid ourselves. He hated the Nazis, but he hated politicians generally. He hated politics. He belonged to a class of German society. His father, was a professor of archaeology, and he was the part of the academic snob culture of German society. This was, there's a wonderful, wonderful book that I can't recommend strongly enough. If you want to understand where this man came from and what his cultural and political beliefs were, it's by a historian, an intellectual historian named Fritz Ringer. And the title of the book is The Decline of the German Mandarins. And it's basically about how the German academic community, which is where Furtwängler came from, was completely incapable of handling the transition to the modern world, modern life, modern politics, and how consequently their basically backward-looking and conservative philosophy was entirely co-opted and became an accomplice, effectively, to the Nazi takeover of German society. And Furtwängler was one of those. It helps to explain why, although he was absolutely opposed to the Nazi regime, and especially to its removal of Jews, for example, from the Berlin Philharmonic, and its sanitization of German culture, there were so many things he also agreed with about Nazi cultural policy, because his own view was rather conservative and philosophically backwards, and that was where he was, and that was why he allowed himself to be used and became a willing accomplice to the German cultural policy of the day, and he became the poster child of Nazi cultural politics. And this he acquiesced in. Let's not kid ourselves. He did it both for his own philosophical and cultural beliefs and his feelings about German culture, but also because everyone else was leaving and he got all the plum jobs if he stuck around. Just like any other self-promoting artist, he was completely self-absorbed and narcissistic and absolutely willing to step on the toes of his colleagues if he could get ahead. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Musicians, of that caliber, conductors, they're not altruists quite often. A surprising number of them were, but they left. Furtwängler stuck around. So, that was the circumstance in which this performance of Beethoven's Ninth took place. Now, Furtwängler, as an interpreter, always had a very, very strong and personal conception of the Ninth. And it was very powerful. It wasn't unique in the sense that, his was like, nobody else was doing anything of similar type. And for example, his handling of flexible tempi. And I mean, if you listen to Hermann Abendroth, for example, do Beethoven's Ninth, you hear something very, very similar to Furtwängler. The only difference is that Abendroth gets the orchestra to do it, where Furtwängler most often does not, because Furtwängler was not an orchestra trainer. He was not a disciplinarian. He was not, from a technical point of view, a very secure conductor. He could get great results when he had an orchestra that played music it knew and was on top of its form. But that wasn't the case in the 1940s. Just remember, the Berlin Philharmonic had gotten rid of all of its Jewish players. It was not in the best estate as an orchestra in the 1940s. Neither was the Vienna Philharmonic. It took quite some time until those orchestras recovered their former brilliance and glory after the war. They had to rebuild. So it's absolutely crazy that people think, when they praise this performance, that the orchestra's any good. It isn't. It's terrible. It's one of the things we're going to be paying attention to. It has good moments, good elements. I mean, they're professionals. They're not going to be cataclysmically amateurish, but they come pretty damn close sometimes. And Furtwängler was usually helpless to do anything about it because he was completely absorbed in the musical conception, in the spiritual and philosophical organic wholeness of the completeness of the Zen-like transmogrification of its music's spiritual awareness. That's what he wanted to convey. I mean, did you ever see him conduct? He had no technique at all. It was really very fascinating. And he claimed that this was his intention. And the reason he claimed it was his intention, of course, is because he couldn't do anything about it. It was just a BS excuse for his own inability to get an orchestra to start together and you sometimes end together. I mean, his stick technique consisted of pointing at the orchestra and sort of starting to do this. And then as the music got going, he would have sort of an epileptic seizure and the stick would start trembling like this. And that was his basic view of conducting. He could get amazing results. He could, because he was a brilliantly talented conductor. I mean, there's no question about that. One who had sometimes fabulously cosmic conceptions of what the music should sound like. And actually, the Ninth was one of them. The only question is whether or not the orchestra had the opportunity and ability to do it on the day. And in March of 1942, they didn't. Now, these wartime performances, I call it the Nazi Ninth, and people have criticized me and jumped up and down because of that and said, well, I mean, he wasn't a Nazi and blah, 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 and all this stuff. Well, let's face it. Let's just have, as we say in Yiddish, let's talk tachlis, the real deal, the bottom line here. The fact of the matter is that the reason that this performance gets a lot of the acclaim it does is because this is when it was made, during wartime, in front of the Nazis. It has a mystique which has been turned to its advantage because of that. I don't see that as an advantage. I just hear indifferent playing under really awful circumstances. And, the fact of the matter is, had it been a great performance of the Ninth, reasonably well recorded, I'd be the first to say so. I really would. I mean, I would say, well, the performance, the circumstances are despicable. Furtwängler's behavior was absolutely unforgivable, but he delivered a great Ninth, and we have to admit it. I feel that way about, the Walter Gieseking Emperor Concerto, the one that was made in experimental stereo while bombs were going off in the background. I mean, it's a really terrific Emperor Concerto, and I listen to it. Sometimes I enjoy it. On the other hand, I wouldn't have minded if one of those bombs had fallen on the concert hall at the time the recording was made, and we would be -1 Emperor Concerto. But who cares? That's okay. It's not like there's any shortage of great Emperor Concertos out there. And that's how it is with Beethoven's Ninth. There's no shortage of really good ones. You have Hitler and Goebbels in the audience. In 1942, if the Allies had known where they were and dropped a bomb on the whole bunch of them, we would have been short one Beethoven's Ninth, but the entire world would have been saved. Countless lives and suffering and misery, and millions of people would have been spared. And for me, that's worth it. Get rid of the whole lot of them. So let's not sentimentalize what this thing is. It's a performance of Beethoven's Ninth, horribly recorded, terribly recorded. And that's my other objection to claims of about the mystical wonderfulness about this performance. Furtwängler gets credit for some really alarming oddities of engineering and balance. The sound is horribly congested, at times distorted. It has very little dynamic range, but certain instruments stick out like raisins in this dark gray pudding. And the instruments that stick out most of all are the timpani. I mean, the engineers turned this piece into a timpani concerto. It's that simple. There is no way in hell that a real performance of the Ninth in a real hall in front of real people ever sounded like this thing does. No one would have tolerated it. The timpani and later the percussion. It's just the apotheosis of vulgarity. And if any conductor other than Furtwängler had attempted to make an orchestra sound like that, people would have been screaming about its tastelessness and its disgusting, noisy insensitivity, because that's how it sounds. That's truly, truly how it sounds. And you'll see for yourself. So why don't we listen to a little bit and you'll see what I mean. Let's start at the beginning with the first movement. Listen to the way Furtwängler attacks the opening theme with this heavy-handed portentousness. Now, you may have noticed that at the end, the winds and the strings are not together. They're almost never together. And I don't mean they're not together rhythmically in this particular case. What isn't together is that attacks and releases are never together. The strings are slashing away. The woodwinds are playing the actual notes that Beethoven wrote, more or less in the time scale that he wrote them. It's very unpleasant. It really is, because the strings and the winds are in unison. And that's one of those details that Furtwängler seldom pays attention to throughout this performance. The fact that vertically speaking, when instruments are all playing together, some play the notes shorter, some longer, and he doesn't care. And that makes for a singularly unpleasant impression. Now, one of the moments in this first movement, which does get moving nicely once it goes, that's also considered to be, an aspect of Furtwängler's mastery, his ability to control flexible tempo. And it often is. It really is. But, in this particular case, it becomes kind of a mannerism. Whenever the music gets loud, it goes faster. Whenever it's slow, it goes, it gets soft, it goes slower. And, it becomes very predictable. But one of the big moments in this first movement is the recap, the recapitulation, which everyone says is just the most cosmic, exciting thing they've ever heard in their lives. Well, here it is. And as usual, you can hear the timpani stick out like crazy. Okay, so it's a recapitulation with loud timpani, but the whole rest of the texture is just gray and clogged, and it's, with the timpani roaring underneath through the whole thing. And monochrome, it's ugly. It's really, really ugly. And it gets even worse in the coda. Oh my God, the coda is just, it's like an impacted wisdom tooth of music. It really is. It's horrendous. And that's the first movement, which is 17 minutes long and recorded throughout in this miserably dull, gray, sonic atmosphere with lots of timpani up front. And of course, when in these performances of Beethoven's Ninth, they were normally given with double timpani and quadruple woodwinds. So, you could hear woodwinds cutting through the texture, and you do sometimes. I mean, you actually do. But that's one of the reasons the timpani are so loud, is because there's more of them than Beethoven actually wrote for. And that's okay. I mean, in festival performances, doubling instruments is perfectly normal. Everybody does it. It's okay. So let's move on to the Scherzo. Now, surprisingly, the Scherzo, which is the toughest movement to play rhythmically, is the best. I mean, they play it very, very well for the most part. Of course, we have the same horrible balances and the same terrible sounding timpani, and but basically they keep it together pretty nicely. But there's one moment that I think is kind of telling and typical of the slipshod character of the performance as a whole, and that's the transition from the trio back to the Scherzo, because there you've got a big retard. Of course, Beethoven doesn't indicate a big retard. That's what Furtwängler plays. Beethoven only wants a poco retard on the last few notes, but Furtwängler's been slowing down way before that happens and brings the whole thing to a halt. And even at this slow tempo, the strings and the woodwinds are not coordinated. I mean, it becomes so slow, and because his beat was so vague, nobody knows where the beats are falling, and so you hear this sort of, how do you describe it? It limps. It's casually sloppy. And then, of course, the return to the Scherzo isn't together either. And the rest of the movement goes pretty well. It really does. Because there was a lot of tempo shifting and there's a lot of rhythm. So obviously, first of all, the orchestra knows it like the back of its hand. And probably they rehearsed it a little bit. The guy knew that he needed to rehearse. And so he did. Now, the Adagio. Oh, the Adagio. This is the part that's supposed to be just incomparably sublime, right? I mean sublime like underneath lime, because it's sub lots of things, sub fusk maybe. I mean, this is really a problem. It takes 20 minutes. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with doing it that slowly. You want to take 20 minutes, take 20 minutes. I mean, Schulte takes 20 minutes and it's beautiful. And his performances, not here, let me tell you. Again, the tempo is so slow that the players are actually unsure of where the beats fall. And you hear that. You hear this sort of tentative ensemble, with one note following another. They're not connected in any meaningful way. But then the woodwinds, the theme is a call and response in a sense. The strings play the theme and then the woodwinds have an answer. Then the strings play the theme, then the woodwinds have an answer. And you hear some of the most sour, unpleasant woodwind intonation you've ever heard in your life. It is so annoyingly unlistenable. Here, listen to this. See what I mean? I mean, it sounds like they're playing quarter tones at some point, doesn't it? And I'm not a pitch guy, I don't have perfect pitch. I don't usually worry about pitch, but there are moments in this performance where it's just, you think they're playing Alwaz Haba, the famous Czech quarter tone composer's, opera, The Mother. It's terrible. It's just terrible. Then, of course, whenever the timpani play, they're twice as loud as they ought to be, and there's nothing spiritual or transcendental about this. I mean, the audience constantly coughing, that helps. That adds a certain atmosphere of authenticity to the whole thing. I mean, I'd be coughing too. It's awful to have to listen to the music distended in that way. And again, Furtwängler could do it. He does it in his Lucerne recording. The last one he made with the Philharmonia, an orchestra that was at the top of its game and could play the music as beautifully as he wanted and sustain it. And he's also just that much quicker, so that the music has a flow it doesn't have here. People talk about, his timelessness, the timeless spirituality of his Adagio. It's not timeless. It's just dead. It's the timelessness of the grave, folks. I mean, who are we kidding? But like all of his performances, it gets moving when it gets moving, and but 20 minutes of this? 20 minutes of lousy woodwind intonation and awful orchestral balances? Then, of course, we come to the finale. Oh, the finale. It's so much fun, isn't it? We have an opening which is typical Furtwängler, The timpani leads off. Then everyone else comes in. It's supposed to be one chord for the whole orchestra all at once, blah, da, 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 right? No. Here it goes, boom, chick, right? Because there's no reason why the orchestra should begin together. I mean, that's for those mechanical, non-spiritual conductors like Toscanini, the ones who care about ensemble, not for Furtwängler. He's only concerned with spiritual values. And what could be more spiritual than an enormous timpani crash followed by a horrible dissonant screech from the rest of the orchestra? I mean, it just sends you into another transcendental realm entirely, doesn't it? Yeah, right, sure. Tell me about it, folks. Okay, so the finale gets going, and it does finale things, and the soloists come in, and they're not particularly good, and it doesn't really matter because the soloists in Beethoven's Ninth are like never particularly good, and no one listens to Beethoven's Ninth for the soloist, right? I mean, never, ever, ever. But then you get to the march with the tenor solo, which is unaccountably too fast. I mean, it just is. It has no swagger at all. It's sort of breathless, goose-stepping Nazis. That's what it sounds like. It's almost uncomfortably swift. And then the fugato afterwards, it's just a mess. I mean, Furtwängler drives it very, very hard. And it's very exciting for that reason, of course. But listen to how the orchestra is like, holding on for dear life and threatening to come apart. There's no consistency of articulation. Again, the ensemble is rather slipshod. If you're going to do it, here's the point, folks. You have an obligation to do it right. It's not just a conductor's job to have a conception. Anyone can have a conception. You can have a conception. I can have a conception. Furtwängler didn't know anything that makes his conception better than your conception. His job was to make an orchestra play his conception. That's professionalism. That's competence. That's where Furtwängler comes short in this performance, because once things get going, he's usually helpless to do anything other than set the tempo and let it rip. And it's really unfortunate, but that's what happens in this performance. And then we have to listen to the ending. Oh, the ending. It's such a scandal. Now, Furtwängler, remember, was very true to Beethoven's conception. Nowadays where everyone is doing, metronome markings and all that crap, they've gone too far in the other direction, in the direction of what they deem to be literal authenticity. And if you follow Beethoven's metronome markings, that prestissimo ending, which should be as fast as humanly possible, is actually rather slow, and it sounds, I don't think, very effective. Furtwängler's conception is fabulous, which is play the damn thing as fast as humanly possible. It's great, but again, there's a limit to what fast as humanly possible means. The limit is what the players can do. Now, some people think it's exciting that Furtwängler drives the music harder than what the players can actually do. And the resulting scrambled mess is supposed to represent the transcendental apotheosis of all human striving. Again, that's an intellectual construct. It has no meaning musically. Now, in this particular performance, which is the worst of all the ones that Furtwängler recorded of this particular passage at the end, it doesn't really matter because you can't hear the orchestra at all. All you hear is the cymbals. I mean, if I showed up with a pair of cymbals and no orchestra and just went crash, 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 crash like this, would you know that Beethoven's Ninth was playing behind it? You wouldn't, because it wouldn't be behind it. Well, it might as well not be behind it. Listen to this farrago of noise. Outrageous, isn't it? Disgusting, despicable. I mean, I don't believe for a moment that this is what Furtwängler intended. I mean, there's a tune back there, right? Right? It's in the trumpets. All you hear is noise. It's just banging and crashing. It's ridiculous. And again, in that Lucerne recording, he does it. The orchestra does it. It isn't notably slower, but you hear the orchestra, you hear the percussion, you hear things in balance. You understand that when Furtwängler got some reasonable, the orchestras, when the engineers at least gave him some reasonable simulacrum of the kind of balances he was shooting for, then a lot of the excitement of this performance goes away. Because the excitement isn't a result of Furtwängler at all. It's a result of bad engineering. That's all it is. It's just bad engineering. So, going through this performance, as we have, if Furtwängler had not been the conductor, if we can banish for a moment the titillating excitement of Nazis hanging around in wartime and tension and all of the unmusical and irrelevant external circumstances, would you ever listen to it more than once? Would you ever listen to it again? Would you listen to it at all after the first 5 minutes? I think probably not for most people. Indeed, the thing about these performances, bad sounding historical recordings that always bothers me personally is that there's no way that people who listen to them can really enjoy them for themselves. In other words, let's say you never listened to Beethoven's Ninth, ever. You never heard it before in your life. And this was your first encounter. Would you come away from it knowing what Beethoven's Ninth really sounds like? What happens in these performances, and the reason I talk about delusional mass hysteria when it comes to this performance, is that the only way you can really give it the kind of outrageous, exaggerated acclaim that it receives is if you know Beethoven's Ninth from someplace else. You know what it's supposed to sound like, and you give Furtwängler and his engineers and orchestra credit for doing that, even when you can't hear it, because it's just not there. It's not in this performance. But you may know other Furtwängler performances. You may have heard the Bayreuth recording or the Lucerne recording, which are in much better sound, although the Bayreuth one it's a mess in a whole nother way. Again, with a pickup orchestra, that Furtwängler was helpless to discipline into a meaningful and coherent ensemble. But, the point is that you know what the work sounds like, and so you hear it, and you know it's happening, and you know what these passages are supposed to be sounding like, even when they don't sound like that. That's the only possible explanation. People write to me full of vitriol and venom, and it's just juicy and wonderful, saying, "Are you saying that I'm delusional, that I don't love the performance for what it is?" Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that professional musicians praise it because they like certain aspects of it, and people who like the Ninth for itself like it because they're hearing their image of a Ninth that is not in the actual sound of the performance, but it allows them a certain level of personal participation in realizing what the experience ought to be. And some people go for that. And you know what? That's okay. If people love it, more power to them. Let them love it. But the reason I'm making this video and the reason I'm saying this is because there are other people out there who want to get to know the Ninth and who are told, and I've seen it on YouTube, and I look at the comments under this performance, this is the only performance to listen to. It's the greatest ever. And folks, if you believe that, then you're going to be stuck with subpar standards and a grotesque idea of what an orchestra really sounds like, and only a very, very partial idea of what Beethoven actually wrote when he wrote his Ninth Symphony. And that's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. So if you're going to like this performance for certain aspects of things that you don't hear anywhere else, great. Go for it. I'm all for it. I think you should, because the fact is it's there for our entertainment. And if you're entertained, who am I to gainsay that? But to claim that this performance has these mysterious, extraordinary qualities, when all it is a dullish, badly played occasion captured in really, really unpleasant sonics, that's what it is. Say what you will, think what you want. That's the reality. You can call it anything you want, but it's a bow wow of a Ninth by any standard, technical, interpretive, and sonic. So keep on listening, but not to this. It's enough already. It's enough with this performance. It's a joke. And I think it's time we finally called it out for what it is. And that's what I hope I've done here. I know there will be those who disagree, and that's fine. That's what makes a railroad, folks. So go for it in whatever way floats your boat. The Nazi Ninth ain't for me. Thank you. Bye-bye.